There are stories that time refuses to let go of. Stories that linger in the quiet corners of a nation's memory, whispered from one generation to the next, as if the land itself refuses to forget. On a blistering summer day in January of 1966, 3 children, Jane, Arnna, and Grant Beaumont, boarded a bus to Glenelg Beach, just a short ride from their suburban home near Adelaide, Australia. They carried towels, coins for lunch, and the kind of innocence only the 1960s could hold, when kids could laugh in the sunshine, free of fear, and parents waved from their porches, trusting the world would keep them safe. But that world changed forever that day. By the time the sun set, the beach had emptied, the laughter had vanished, and so had the Beaumont children. No footprints, no belongings, no witnesses who saw them leave. And in that void between the waves and the wind, began one of the darkest, most haunting mysteries in modern history. This is not just a story about 3 missing children. It's a story about a nation's innocence, lost in a single afternoon, about the desperate search for answers that stretched across decades, and about the heartbreak of parents who never stopped waiting by the door. My name is Alex Carter, and tonight I'll take you back to that summer of 1966, to the moment Australia changed forever. Thanks for your time you always spend to watch our videos. We greatly value your support, so please share this video with your loved ones. Do us a favor and subscribe right away, regardless of where you are watching. Let's dive into the disappearance of the Beaumont children, 1966. The Summer of Innocence. The year was 1966, a time when Australia felt young, safe, and full of promise. The streets of Adelaide were quiet and neatly kept. Doors were left unlocked, neighbors knew one another by name, and kids roamed freely from morning till dusk. The Beaumont family lived in the modest seaside suburb of Somerton Park. Jim Beaumont was a traveling salesman, reliable, kind, often on the road but always present when it mattered. His wife, Nancy, was the kind of mother who knew every sound in the house, every tone in her children's laughter. Their 3 children were the picture of early 60s innocence. 9-year-old Jane, mature beyond her years, often helped her mother with chores. 7-year-old Arnna was lively, curious, and a spark of mischief. And little Grant, just 4 years old, was the family's sunshine, always smiling, always tagging along. That Australia Day morning, January 26th, dawned bright and unbearably hot, the kind of day when the beach called to everyone. The children begged to go to Glenelg Beach, just a 5-minute bus ride away. It wasn't their first time alone. They had made the trip before, and their mother trusted Jane to look after her younger siblings. Nancy hesitated, mothers always do, but finally agreed. She handed them a few coins for the bus and lunch, kissed them goodbye, and reminded Jane to be home by the 2 p.m. bus. As they walked down the street toward the bus stop, towels slung over their shoulders and sandals kicking up dust, Nancy watched from the doorway, waving until they turned the corner. She didn't know it then, but that moment, that simple wave, would become the last image she ever had of her children alive. The bus driver later recalled seeing them climb aboard, cheerful and polite, chatting about the heat and the sea. By 10 a.m. they had arrived at Glenelg, the crowded beach pulsing with holiday energy. Children laughing, radios playing, the air thick with sunscreen and salt. They were seen again around 11 a.m., playing near the shore. Everything seemed perfectly ordinary, but as the day wore on, that ordinary would dissolve into something unthinkable. And by sunset, Australia would never feel safe again. The bus driver later recalled seeing them climb aboard, cheerful and polite, chatting about the heat and the sea. By 10 a.m. they had arrived at Glenelg, the crowded beach pulsing with holiday energy. Children laughing, radios playing, the air thick with sunscreen and salt. They were seen again around 11 a.m., playing near the shore. Everything seemed perfectly ordinary, but as the day wore on, that ordinary would dissolve into something unthinkable. And by sunset, Australia would never feel safe again. The morning they left. For Nancy Beaumont, that morning felt no different from any other holiday. The sunlight poured in through the kitchen window. The air smelled faintly of toast and sea breeze. Her children were full of laughter. Grant running in circles, Arnna teasing him about bringing his toy shovel, and Jane neatly folding the towels into the beach bag. Everything was normal, ordinary, but in the quiet rhythm of a parent's life, ordinary can sometimes be deceptive. At 8:45 a.m., Nancy gave Jane a final reminder. Be kind to your brother and sister. Don't talk to strangers. Be back by 2. She didn't say it out of fear, just habit. Because in 1966, that's what mothers said, even when danger seemed unimaginable. The bus stop was only a few hundred yards away. Jane held Grant's hand while Arnna walked ahead, bouncing with excitement. Their neighbor, Mrs. Dent, saw them climb onto the Glenelg-bound bus, 3 children among dozens of holidaygoers heading toward the coast. The bus driver, a man named Tom Patterson, would later describe them as polite and happy. They sat together near the front, looking out the window as the suburban streets gave way to the glittering coastline. At 10 a.m. they arrived. The beach was alive, hundreds of families, laughter, vendors selling ice cream and soda, and the waves rolling lazily under the hot summer sun. Witnesses saw the Beaumont children spread their towels near the shallow surf, Jane watching over her siblings as they played in the sand. To anyone passing by, they looked like the picture of freedom, 3 innocent faces glowing in the Australian sun. But within hours, that picture would fade into tragedy. At 11:45 a.m., they were spotted buying meat pies and drinks from a nearby bakery. The owner, Mrs. Wanders, would later recall something odd. The children paid with a £1 note, a bill Nancy insisted she hadn't given them. That was the first red flag. A small chilling clue that someone else, someone unseen, was with them. Witnesses on the beach between 11 a.m. and noon. Several witnesses saw the Beaumont children playing near the jetty, with a man. He was described as tall, tanned, athletic, and blonde. He wore blue swimming trunks and seemed relaxed and confident, as if he belonged there. One witness remembered him playing in the sand with the children, helping them build a sandcastle. Another said the children appeared comfortable with him, laughing, showing no sign of fear. In fact, one person later recalled that Arnna called the man by name, suggesting they might have met before. That detail would haunt investigators for decades. Who was he? And how did the children know him? When the family didn't return on the 2 p.m. bus, Nancy wasn't immediately alarmed. It was hot and the beach was crowded. Maybe they caught the 2:30 p.m. instead. But when that bus came and went, and the children weren't on it, a knot formed in her stomach. By 3 p.m. she was pacing the living room. By 5 o'clock she was calling neighbors. By 7:30 panic had replaced reason. Jim Beaumont returned home from a sales trip to find his wife white with fear, the children still missing. He got in the car and drove to Glenelg Beach, headlights sweeping across the empty sand as dusk settled over the coastline. The beach that had been full of laughter hours earlier was now eerily quiet, scattered towels, the scent of salt, and the long echo of waves crashing against the shore. Jim searched every corner, the changing rooms, the jetty, nearby shops, asking anyone who would listen. Nobody had seen them leave. Nobody saw them board a bus. It was as if the children had simply vanished. At 10 p.m. the police were called. Officers arrived with flashlights, combing the sand and searching the nearby park and playground. They checked the drains, the parking lot, and even the coastline. But there was no sign of Jane, Arnna, or Grant. By midnight, the Beaumont home was filled with officers, neighbors, and stunned silence. Nancy sat on the couch, her hands trembling, whispering the same sentence over and over. They've never stayed out late before. The police had no answers that night, only questions. And as the hours turned into dawn, Australia woke to the beginning of its greatest mystery. The vanishing when the sun set on January 26, 1966, Glenelg Beach emptied. Families packed their towels, children carried melting ice cream cones, and radios played fading summer tunes. But 3 towels, 3 small piles of clothes, remained on the sand. The Beaumont children were nowhere to be found. At first, police believed they may have wandered off. Perhaps they'd gone to visit friends, or maybe they'd caught a different bus home. But as hours passed, every reasonable explanation dissolved into dread. By midnight, the search had become desperate. Officers scoured the beach with flashlights, their beams cutting across the sand. Divers searched the shallows. Volunteers walked the dunes, calling the children's names into the wind. Jane, Arnna, Grant. The calls went unanswered. The Beaumont home that night became a hub of confusion and hope. Neighbors gathered outside, reporters began to arrive, and officers filled the living room with notepads and maps. Nancy sat in silence, her eyes fixed on the door, expecting it to open at any moment. Jim moved restlessly between the windows, searching for headlights on the road, but the road stayed dark. By morning, the story had reached every radio station in Adelaide. 3 Beaumont children missing, last seen at Glenelg Beach. The word sent chills through an entire city. This was not a family that ran away. This was not a misunderstanding. Something had happened, something unthinkable. Detective Lynn Brown took charge of the case. He immediately organized what would become one of the largest search operations in Australian history. Over the next 24 hours, more than 250 police officers and hundreds of volunteers joined the search. They combed through every inch of Glenelg. The dunes, the drainage pipes, the carnival grounds, the foreshore and nearby hotels. Nothing. Not a single piece of clothing. Not a single footprint that led to a clue. It was as if the children had walked into the air itself. The search that shook a nation. Police have confirmed the disappearance of the 3 Beaumont children from Glenelg Beach yesterday afternoon. Searches are ongoing. Within a day, the Beaumont case had spread beyond Adelaide. Within a week, it was national news. Australia had never seen anything like it. Families locked their doors. Parents who once waved their children off without a thought now clutched their hands tighter. The media descended on Glenelg Beach. Reporters lined the promenade. Photographs of Jane, Arnna, and Grant appeared on front pages from Sydney to Perth. The nation watched in horror as police dogs, divers, and soldiers joined the effort. They searched construction sites, empty homes, and storm drains. Helicopters flew overhead, scanning the coastline. Still nothing. Detectives interviewed thousands of people. Every taxi driver, every shop owner, every witness who might have seen something. Dozens claimed they'd seen the children, but each lead crumbled under scrutiny. The description of the tall blonde man became the central focus. Sketch artists drew his face based on witness testimony. A strong jaw, tan skin, light hair, and about 30 years old. But no one could name him. Rumors spread quickly. Some said the children had drowned. Others whispered about abduction. Still others suggested something even darker. A planned kidnapping by someone who had gained the children's trust. The £1 note, the stranger's easy rapport, and the laughter on the sand all pointed to someone they knew. Someone who made them feel safe. Nancy and Jim appeared briefly before cameras. Their faces were pale, voices trembling. Nancy whispered to a reporter, "I just want them home. Please, if someone has them, bring them back." But behind her plea was a silence that stretched across the country. Every mother and every father saw themselves in the Beaumonts that week. The beaches grew quieter. Parents no longer let their children out of sight. Australia's golden age of trust was over. And still, the question echoed like a ghost through every home, every police station, and every whispered prayer. Where are the Beaumont children? The stranger on the sand in the weeks that followed, one image haunted every detective, every parent, and every newspaper in Australia. The sketch of a man on the beach. He was tanned, athletic, and blonde. Witnesses described him as friendly, maybe 30, confident, the kind of man who could charm children without seeming threatening. He had been seen playing in the sand with the Beaumont kids, laughing, helping them bury Grant up to his neck, tossing a ball, then walking with them toward the changing rooms. After that moment, no one ever saw the children again. Police gave the sketch to the media. It spread across front pages nationwide under the headline, "The Man on the Beach." Hotlines rang day and night. Hundreds of tips came in, each one promising, each one collapsing under scrutiny. Some claimed the man was a local lifeguard. Others said he was a construction worker or traveler passing through. But none matched perfectly. Detectives began to suspect something chilling. This man wasn't a random stranger. He might have watched the Beaumonts before, learning their routine, waiting for the right moment to strike. A friend of the family mentioned something that made investigators freeze. Arnna, just days before the disappearance, had told her mother something strange. She said they had made a new friend at the beach. Nancy hadn't thought much of it at the time. In the 1960s, it wasn't unusual for friendly adults to chat with kids at the beach. But now it carried a horrifying weight. This was no random act. It was deliberate. Someone had gained their trust, and then quietly took them away. Detectives followed every possible lead. They interviewed known offenders, transient workers, visiting carnival staff, and sailors from nearby ships. They compared alibis, tracked vehicle registrations, and even questioned hypnotists and psychics. But every path ended the same way, in silence. And as January turned to February, hope began to fade. The beach emptied. The search parties grew smaller. The laughter that once echoed across Glenelg was replaced by whispers of fear. The investigation deepens as the weeks stretched into months. The Beaumont investigation became an obsession for both police and the public. Detective Len Brown, now leading the case full-time, set up a dedicated task force. Files piled high across desks, photos and maps plastered the walls. Red strings connecting theories that never met in the middle. Forensic work in 1966 was primitive by today's standards. No DNA, no digital tracking, no surveillance cameras. The investigation relied on witness memory, instinct, and endurance. Each new tip sparked a wave of hope. Each false lead broke another piece of the Beaumonts' hearts. Nancy barely slept. Jim stopped working. Their home turned into a waiting room for grief. In early February, police received a promising call. A woman claimed she'd seen a man matching the description entering a house near Glenelg with 3 children. Officers rushed to the address, but the home was empty. The occupants had moved out days earlier. Inside, they found only silence and dust. Then came the letters. Weeks later, the Beaumonts received an envelope postmarked from Dandenong, Victoria. Inside was a note, written in what appeared to be Jane's handwriting. It said the children were living with someone who loved and cared for them, and that they'd soon come home. Nancy's hand shook as she read it. For the first time in months, she allowed herself to hope. A second letter followed, this time supposedly from the man himself, promising to return the children in person. Police arranged a sting operation at the appointed meeting place. The Beaumonts waited for hours. No one came. Later, handwriting analysis revealed what every mother dreads to hear. It was a cruel hoax, written by a man seeking attention. He confessed. He never knew the Beaumonts. Nancy collapsed when she heard. Jim wept silently beside her. From that day forward, they stopped speaking to the press. They refused television interviews. They couldn't bear the cameras, the questions, or the pity. Years later, neighbors would say the Beaumonts' house grew quieter and quieter, as if grief itself had moved in and never left. The investigation continued, but the leads grew colder. Each passing anniversary brought another headline, another promise of new evidence, and then more disappointment. By 1968, the case had gone from urgent to unsolved, but the nation couldn't move on. No one could. The disappearance of Jane, Arnna, and Grant had changed Australia forever. The letters and the hoax. For months, Jim and Nancy Beaumont lived in a suspended kind of grief. A life split in two. Before that summer day and after it, every phone call jolted them awake. Every knock at the door froze their breath. Each passing day felt like an echo of loss, one that refused to fade. Then a glimmer of hope arrived. It was March 1968, 2 years after the children had vanished, when the first letter came. It was addressed directly to the Beaumonts. Inside, written in careful, uneven handwriting, was a message that seemed impossible. It began, "Dear Mom and Dad, we are safe and well. We have a nice man who looks after us. We love you." It was signed Jane. Nancy recognized the handwriting immediately, or at least she wanted to. The shape of the letters, the phrasing, it felt like Jane. A second letter soon followed, written in an adult's hand, claiming to be from the man caring for them. He said he was ready to bring the children home, if only the police stayed away. It was the first true spark of hope the Beaumonts had felt in years. Detectives, cautious but desperate, arranged a covert meeting. They chose a small park in suburban Adelaide. Jim Beaumont went alone, sitting quietly on a bench as officers hid nearby. The hour passed. Then another. No one came. Days later, investigators traced the letters back to a university student in Melbourne. A man who admitted he had forged both notes as a prank. He said he'd wanted to see if he could get away with it. He did not grasp, or perhaps did not care, that his letters had torn open wounds that would never heal. Nancy collapsed when she heard the truth. Jim fell into silence for days. Neighbors said they could hear Nancy crying through the night, soft, breaking sobs that never truly stopped. From that day forward, the Beaumonts withdrew completely. No more interviews. No more hope for false miracles. They waited quietly, endlessly for something real. Theories and suspects with no arrests, no bodies, and no answers, the Beaumont case became fertile ground for speculation. Decades of theories, some credible, some cruel, tried to fill the silence left behind. The first major suspect was a local tailor and wealthy businessman named Harry Phipps. He lived less than 400 meters from Glenelg Beach, in a mansion overlooking the shoreline. To the outside world, he was respectable, charming, successful. But whispers followed him. He was known to have a dark temper and unsettling interests. Former employees would later claim that around the time of the children's disappearance, Phipps had asked two teenage workers to dig a large hole on his property. Years later, when investigators searched that same site, they found disturbed soil, but no remains. Still, many believed Phipps could have been the blonde man witnesses saw. He matched the physical description almost perfectly, yet without evidence, he was never charged. Another theory emerged in the 1980s, one that would send new chills through the country. It centered on Bevan Spencer von Einem, a convicted murderer and pedophile linked to the notorious family murders in Adelaide. Von Einem's crimes in the late 1970s involved the abduction and murder of young men, crimes disturbingly similar in their planning and control. Rumors swirled that von Einem had bragged about abducting the Beaumonts years earlier, though no proof ever surfaced. Detectives questioned him repeatedly. He denied everything. Still, many couldn't shake the feeling that the same dark network that took lives in the 70s may have begun with the Beaumonts in the 60s. There were others too, transient workers, sailors, strangers passing through. Each name lit up in red on the task force board, each one fading out with time. In 2013, nearly 5 decades after the disappearance, police excavated a factory site once owned by Harry Phipps. Ground-penetrating radar had revealed anomalies in the soil, possible graves. News cameras crowded the site. Reporters whispered that, finally, the Beaumonts might come home. But when the ground was opened, it was empty once again. Just dirt and heartbreak. The case files grew thicker. Generations of detectives came and went. And still the mystery remained, unsolved, unrelenting, unforgettable. No matter how much time passed, the faces of Jane, Arnna, and Grant never aged. Their smiles, frozen in 1966, became symbols of a nation's loss of innocence. Decades of silence as the years passed, the story of the Beaumont children turned from breaking news into legend. But for Jim and Nancy Beaumont, it never stopped being personal. Every birthday, every Christmas, every summer's day at Glenelg Beach was a reminder of what once was and what could never be again. They kept the same home in Somerton Park for decades. Jane's schoolbook still sat on her shelf. Arnna's favorite doll, the one with the cracked porcelain face, stayed on her bed. And Grant's tiny shoes were still lined neatly at the door. They couldn't move them. They couldn't move on. Time was not kind. By the mid-1970s, their marriage began to crumble under the weight of endless grief. The love that had once held them together, laughter around the breakfast table, quiet talks after the children's bedtime, was now replaced with silence and sorrow. They eventually separated, though they never blamed each other. How could they? Both had lost the same world. Nancy lived quietly for decades, rarely speaking to the media again. Jim stayed in the Adelaide area, working, always looking. Even in old age, scanning the faces of strangers in crowds, hoping for a glimpse that never came. The police task force changed hands dozens of times. Every new generation of detectives began with the same hope. We'll be the ones to finally solve it. But each time the evidence led them in circles. Witness memories faded, files went missing, evidence degraded, and still the case stayed open. In 1998, detectives made a grim decision. The Beaumont file, now as thick as a brick, was officially labeled a cold case. But to the people of Australia, it was never cold. It was a scar, still tender, still bleeding. Even decades later, visitors to Glenelg Beach said they could feel something different there. A heaviness, as if the sand itself remembered what had happened. Hope in the shadows. 50 years after the disappearance, technology finally caught up with the mystery. New forensic tools, ground radar, DNA mapping, and digital archives gave detectives fresh ways to search old ghosts. In 2013, police returned to the site once owned by Harry Phipps, the businessman long suspected of knowing more than he admitted. With cadaver dogs and radar scanners, they mapped the earth beneath the old factory floor. The readings were strange. A pattern in the soil, roughly rectangular, roughly human-sized. The world held its breath. Was this it? Had the Beaumonts finally been found? The dig went on for days. News helicopters hovered overhead. Elderly couples stood at the fence, holding hands, whispering prayers. But when the earth was finally opened, there was nothing. No bones. No answers. Just the faint, hollow echo of hope collapsing once again. Then in 2018, a new lead emerged, one buried deep in the archives. A retired detective discovered a long-forgotten witness statement from the 1960s. A postal worker who had seen a man with 3 children boarding a small van near the beach that day. The man's description, tall, blonde, confident, matched the mysterious stranger once again. But by now, every suspect was either deceased or untraceable. The trail had gone colder than ever. And yet, something about this case refused to die. Even after 60 years, people still send in tips. Some claim to have seen the children alive, grown, living new lives under new names. Others swear they know where the bodies lie. But every story, every clue, every rumor leads to the same question. What really happened to Jane, Arnna, and Grant Beaumont? We may never know. But in some ways, the mystery has outlived its truth. Because what the Beaumonts left behind wasn't just a question, it was a warning. A nation once so trusting learned that evil could walk in daylight, smile at your children, and vanish into thin air. The legacy. It has been almost 60 years since 3 smiling children walked out the door for a day at the beach and never came home. Their names, Jane, Arnna, and Grant Beaumont, are still spoken with tenderness, almost reverence across Australia. They belong to a generation's collective memory. A wound that never closed, a story retold not out of morbid fascination, but because it changed everything. Before 1966, Australia was innocent. Children roamed free, neighbors didn't lock doors, and trust came as naturally as sunlight. But after that day, something in the country's heart shifted. Parents started holding hands a little tighter. Communities began to watch over one another. And the word stranger danger entered the national vocabulary. The disappearance became the defining mystery of the 20th century in Australia. It forced law enforcement to modernize and to create child protection units, missing persons databases, and coordinated investigations. It reshaped how media handled tragedy, how empathy and restraint had to coexist with the public's right to know. But behind the headlines and the history books, there were still 2 parents, Jim and Nancy Beaumont, who lived every single day with one unanswered question. They never stopped loving their children. They never stopped hoping. Even in old age, Jim was known to keep an old newspaper clipping folded inside his wallet, the one with their faces smiling back at him. When Nancy passed away in 2019, she was buried beside a space left for him. A space that, in spirit, still waits for their 3 children. People sometimes ask why stories like this still matter. Why tell them again when they bring such pain? Because silence is the real tragedy. Because remembering their names keeps them alive in the only way we can. Because through their story we're reminded that vigilance is not fear. It's love in its most protective form. And because somewhere, out there, there are still parents searching, still detectives digging through old files, still communities refusing to let the lost be forgotten. So tonight we remember them. Jane, the thoughtful big sister who carried her book everywhere she went. Arnna, the spirited middle child with the mischievous grin. Grant, the youngest, always chasing laughter and sunlight. 3 children who wanted nothing more than a day at the beach. 3 lives that became symbols of hope, heartbreak, and an unending search for truth. May their story remind us that behind every headline is a family. Behind every mystery, a heartbeat once full of life. And behind every tragedy, a lesson. That love never really disappears. For Jane, Arnna, and Grant Beaumont, you are remembered. Always. Thanks for watching. Do us a favor and subscribe to the Famographic Show.